shouldn't you do a little bit more research with the size of the platform that you have before making those kinds of claims about people to hundreds of thousands of people at a time? All right, guys, today for a special episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, we're bringing on ParkerGetAJob, one of the viral white dudes for Harris TikTok stars who recently made a video, frankly, lying about me. I call him out on this, and we discuss politics more broadly in this episode. Parker, thanks for coming on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
So I want to start with what got us connected in the first place, which was you guys did this TikTok with a bunch of kind of center-left influencers where you talked about this kind of stick of like, oh, did I get too political? My bad. And then you made a political point of why politics is important to you.
Sorry, was I too political? My bad. I just want to be able to marry my girlfriend one day.
My bad. Did I get too political? I just want to make sure kids can go to school without fearing for their lives.
Oh, was I too political? I'm sorry. I just don't want to have to be a girl again.
Oh, was I too political? I don't want a rapist to have access to nuclear weapons the same way I wouldn't want them to have access to a gun.
I did a reaction to it on this show that people might remember if they're loyal viewers or listeners. And that actually went a little bit viral. It got a couple million views. And then you responded to the portion of it about you. I want to roll the first bit of that for you to take a listen to right now.
Was I too political? I don't want a rapist to have access to nuclear weapons.
So I do find it very concerning that Trump was held liable for sexual abuse of E. Jean Carroll in civil court. I really do.
But you still voted for him.
Did you know that I actually didn't vote for Donald Trump? I actually voted for Chase Oliver, the Libertarian Party candidate. And you have over 1 million TikTok followers. You didn't think to Google or chatbot search even who did Brad Polumbo vote for before making that out and blasting it out to 500,000 people?
No, I do apologize for that. Like that's not something that I expected. I did expect that it was like a Trump supporter responding to that type of content. So I appreciate you telling me that because I didn't know that. And actually I did try to like search to see that. And it seemed like you had some content that was sort of Trump leaning, but it's good to hear that you didn't. Yeah, of course I should search on TikTok.
Okay.
So there's going to be various things that probably
I checked this because I wanted to see like, is this, I don't expect you to have watched my podcast or watch my YouTube content. But if you Google who did Brad Polumbo vote for, a tweet where I said I'm voting for Chase Oliver comes up as the third or fourth result, or at least it did for me. If you ask chatbot who did Brad Polumbo vote for, it says Brad Polumbo sat out the 2020 election and said he's not voting for Trump or Biden in 2024 and is considering voting for Chase Oliver. So I guess the question I have is first, shouldn't you do a little bit more research with the size of the platform that you have before making those kinds of claims about people to hundreds of thousands of people at a time?
So sure, yeah, I would say that I have to do a bit more research when it comes to things like that, especially in terms of political candidates. Now, I did expect that you were supporting Trump because of the response that you made in specific about the cases, particularly relating to the idea that like there's a distinction between a civil and a criminal court. I've never heard like a Chase Oliver fan argue that. And then secondly, we could talk about like I don't know why you would have voted for Chase Oliver. We can go through that because obviously they don't have like a chance of winning, and you clearly saw that through the election. But yeah, no, I will actually like literally take down my video because I said that within the video. So I do actually appreciate you telling me that, and I actually really apologize for framing it that way because I did actually
that. And honestly,
wrongly.
I don't care that much. You don't need to take down the video. I just think so. I followed you closely. I followed Dean. I followed a couple of the other guys who, Harry, Chris, for a while, kind of white dudes for Kamala. And I'm not caricaturing you guys as that. You guys have like branded as that. And some of your videos, I think you make interesting points against people like Charlie Kirk in debates. I actually think your point about the Electoral College being a form of DEI is very interesting and actually kind of made me think, though I've never been a big supporter of the Electoral College. I've always had kind of mixed feelings about it. But then it seems to me that you guys, the same way you kind of have the Charlie Kirks of the world who are team red and who just, no matter what Trump says or does, will defend it and will twist themselves into pretzels. Charlie Kirk started his career as a free trade advocate. Now he loves tariffs because Trump likes tariffs. It seems to me that you guys often engage in politics in kind of the opposite mirror way of this Team Blue NPC, where anything Kamala says or does, you'll defend. Anything Trump is bad. And do you not see some kind of mirror or acknowledge that this partisan or tribal approach to politics is like you assume because somebody's disagreeing with certain criticisms you made of Trump, they must be a Trump supporter. The world's actually a lot more nuanced and complicated than that. And even somebody who loves Kamala and hates Trump might think a specific argument you're making is weak or wrong or bad. Do you see what I'm saying here about how this approach to politics is partisan and tribal? It's not nuanced.
No, I understand the point that you're making there. Now, that is totally my fault because in typical, I debate people every single day. I know what types of points typically bring about particular viewpoints. So it is very likely that if someone is making that type of argument, that they are a Trump supporter. So I do, again, I was totally wrong, but I don't think that I need to like have 100% certainty that someone would be like a particular or have a particular view to like be able to establish like an argument from that perspective. Right, within conversations all the time, right? I might assume someone is coming from a particular perspective, given that they're arguing something, and they can just clarify in that type of conversation. That's not the view that they have. Now, it's a lot easier in like live debates and conversations like that than it would be like on a video setting. So I do see you there, and I'm not really like as familiar with video content. I'm mainly like a debate person, like on lives. So like I haven't done that type of stuff. So I do apologize for portraying it that way. And I understand the perspective of, oh, you guys just say like whatever Kamala wants, or you agree with them 100%. And I would just like to clarify, I definitely don't agree with Kamala Harris 100%. And I'm actively like very critical of them on my platform all the time, especially with people like Joe Biden. Like I was one of the people advocating for Joe Biden to step down prior to the vast sort of push by the media and everything like that for him to step down. So like I'm not someone who's just going to follow the Democratic position in every single position, although it might seem like that because of just like the types of arguments that I would typically engage with.
Can you name a couple things that you think Trump is right about?
Yeah. So, for example, I think that Trump is right about the trans bathroom issue. Like specifically, I saw you making tweets about that specifically, that like there shouldn't be like a reason to restrict trans people from going into the bathrooms in which they specifically have commitments or desires to be in accordance with in terms of an identity. So like that's one thing. There's Operation Warp Speed. I think that the push for vaccines very fast was actually very good. I also agree that we need to increase like specific manufacturing in the United States, although I disagree with him on how he's going to get there. And then also I agree with tax cuts for middle class individuals. Those are just a few things. I can keep going.
There you go. I appreciate that. I'm somebody who looks at Trump, sees some of his ideas as bad, some of his ideas as good. Kamala, even Kamala, right? I could name a couple things. I think she's got some smart things that she campaigned on about housing policy, about decreasing regulations, increasing housing supply. I think when you have people who actually try to boil down the world to blue is 100% correct and red is 100% wrong, or vice versa, to me, that's always a sign that somebody's not thinking critically about the issues, because real life is complicated. There's a reason that these issues divide us, and it's not all black and white. Now, let's get into the rest of this video and maybe talk about the E. Jean Carroll case and the distinction between civil and criminal cases. Take a listen to the rest of your video that you made responding to me. But it's not the same thing as a criminal conviction. There's a much lower standard of proof.
So are you saying someone held civilly liable of forcefully penetrating a woman's vagina against her will, unanimously by a jury of 9 people when the decision didn't have to be unanimous, should be able to get access to a gun?
And what it has to do with nuclear weapons, I'm not really sure.
If you wouldn't trust them with arms like guns, why would you trust them with arms like nuclear weapons?
Even a leader who did, let's say, commit a horrible crime against another person isn't going to necessarily start a nuclear war. Trump was already president once and didn't start any new wars.
Even if the person who was held civilly liable of forcefully penetrating a woman's vagina against her will didn't use a gun in any prior crimes or any prior violent occurrences, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't restrict their access to a gun. The same way that just because Donald Trump didn't use nuclear weapons in a negative connotation when he was president doesn't mean he wouldn't do so in this context, or that we would trust him with it. He also advocated for nuking hurricanes?
We're all so propagandistic and low information and manipulative and just reducing the complexity of our politics into these sound bites meant to scare people rather than inform or persuade them.
That's really funny, coming from the party of the press is the enemy of the people, stop the steal, terminate the Constitution, immigrants are poisoning the blood of this country and eating cats and dogs. Are you crazy?
So the bit at the end there, I have been very outspoken that I don't think the 2020 election was stolen. I'm not part of the Stop the Steal movement. I didn't ever claim there were dogs and cats in being eaten. I'm actually pretty pro legal immigration. And I actually just did a segment on why I oppose mass deportation. So again, I would just kind of caution you to stop lumping people in or making assumptions about people because of one issue. They must hold the whole host of views that are associated with that side or that spectrum.
So I wasn't doing that. What I was doing in that particular scenario was I was saying that, like, if you're going to say that, like, oh, all of this is just sort of low information, it's all of these people that are typically on this side that typically have that type of low information. What you were kind of doing in that circumstance was sort of lumping me in with the rest. So what I'm kind of doing is I'm showing that, like, you can't sort of do that in terms of the party, just lump everyone with that sort of side, if that made sense. But
Right. Well, when I was
completely
saying-
disagree with this framing because you didn't vote for Trump, right? Like I totally take back all of this framing as it relates to this because you didn't vote for him. You don't have that type of obligatory stance. You don't have to say that you think that violent offenders should be able to get access to guns, like people who are held civilly liable of sexual abuse. You can step away from that and you can be like, okay, I don't hold to those views. It would be unreasonable to say that. So, like, actually, when it comes to all of that perspective, I don't think this argument is even targeted towards you. And I think it was honestly, like, I agree in a certain sense. It was low information on specifically you. Like, I didn't know much about you for me to assume that you specifically had those views when clearly you didn't hold that stance, right? So, like, I do want to take that back
information
when I was
and talking points. I was actually talking about the original viral video where you guys were just like, oh, my bad, did I get too political? And then you would say a super simplistic talking point that was like 5 seconds. And I understand that's the nature of political content or like social media content, but yours wasn't that bad. Some of the other ones in that video were kind of ridiculous, like were based, and I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I did a step-by-step reaction. And a couple of them were things like that girl, the one whose last name is Cyrus, but isn't actually related to Miley Cyrus, said something about, about gay marriage. I just want to be able to get married. But of course, one, I think it's pretty unlikely the Supreme Court will overturn gay marriage. Even if they did, there's the Respect for Marriage Act in place. And Trump says he's fine with gay marriage, doesn't necessarily want to repeal the Respect for Marriage Act. So some of the things in that video I thought were propagandistic. Yours, I just kind of disagreed with for the reasons I mentioned. I mean, is there not much of a difference to you between a civil liability claim and case and a criminal case?
So I would say that there is a distinction. The distinction in terms of standard of evidence within the context of a civil court would be preponderance of evidence versus in a criminal court, it's like beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's a distinction in terms of standard of evidence. I'm not disputing that.
But that's a huge distinction, though. You know that, right?
You could say it's a huge distinction, but the point I'm making is that it's not a huge distinction as it relates to the point that I'm bringing up, because I still don't think someone that has like a civil liability case against them for something like sexual abuse, domestic violence, or any other type of violent offense like that should be able to get access to guns.
But
like, I think if we're serious about
these states.
Yeah. Just because it's currently legal doesn't mean it's justified, right? You wouldn't say just because things are currently legal, that means they should be that way.
Well, in general, no. In this case, I don't think a civil liability case is enough to deprive someone of fundamental rights, like the Second Amendment right to bear arms. Because when you say the case, the difference in the standard of evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt versus by a preponderance of the evidence. A preponderance of the evidence, which is the burden of proof in a civil liability case, only requires 51% certainty that they did the thing they're accused of doing. It is more likely than not. So a jury to find Donald Trump liable for sexual abuse in that case, which again, I really do find very concerning, only has to be 51% certain that he actually did the thing that he's accused of to find him liable for it. Whereas in a criminal court case, beyond a reasonable doubt, you're talking more like 99% sure, right? It's a very big difference in the burden of proof. And if you believe, like I do, that the Second Amendment rights are a constitutional right, that self-defense is a human right, you wouldn't want to deprive somebody of that with only 51% certainty. Now, if they've been criminally convicted, and you're near certain they did the thing, that is different. But 51% certainty to deny someone their fundamental rights isn't something I would support. No.
So, like, specifically, like, people held civilly liable of sexually abusing children, you'd be fine with them getting guns?
Well, fine with. I wouldn't want them to be legally denied that with such a low burden of proof. No.
So legally, people held civilly liable of sexually abusing children should be able to get guns?
Yes,
and, like, beating their wife and domestic violence?
Unless they're criminally convicted or they have a domestic violence restraining order.
What about getting access to, say, being like a gym teacher or like a babysitter? Like, would you hire them for those positions?
Absolutely not. But there's no constitutional right to be a gym teacher.
You could say that there's not a constitutional right, but the point I'm saying is that
That's a pretty
it
big
provides
difference.
enough of a standard, sure, but like it provides a standard of enough for you to believe it in a particular circumstance, or to think it's likely enough where you want to back up and not engage with that person. So what I'm just trying to demonstrate is that it still meets a particular standard of evidence where you would say like, I'm going to restrict engaging with them in these particular ways, right? I'm not going to hire them for a particular position. That's all required for the argument. But like in terms of like the position with guns, like I definitely vehemently disagree with this. I think it's kind of like an absurd position to say that like you would want them to have guns, right? Just because you want to support like the constitutional right. But I'm seeing that
Could you
perspective is coming from like a libertarian,
Could you
right?
take any other perspective? So, any other constitutional right? So, free speech, for example. Could I say anybody who's been convicted of a bad crime, not convicted, found civilly liable of a bad crime, loses their right to freedom of speech?
It depends on what do they do. Like I wouldn't take away all their rights to
Anything.
freedom of
If
speech.
say they were found for wrongful death, right? Like a civil case, like a O.J. Simpson was acquitted criminally, but found civilly liable for the death of the woman that he allegedly killed. Could you say, well, if you're found civilly liable for wrongful death, you lose your right to free speech? You no longer have a First Amendment right.
So in terms of like the First Amendment right, I wouldn't see how necessary that would be to like restrict someone's free speech in particular circumstances, comparative to like say access to like a gun,
Could you ban
right? Because
them
I think
from
that
working for a newspaper ever?
like would I be okay with doing that in terms of like civil liability for like if someone was held civilly liable of sexually abusing one, I'm okay with banning them from newspapers. That's fine.
So you
I don't have
don't
an issue
really
with that.
believe in rights.
I do believe in rights. I think that's a good enough standard to say that like I wouldn't want them to have such an influence right over right vast majority of people, right? Because they were held civilly liable unanimously in by a jury of 9 people for like this terrible crime, like forcefully penetrating a woman's vagina against her will.
Where does it say that in the First Amendment? Freedom of the press, except if you've been found civilly liable for a crime.
Yeah, so I don't take it in terms of an absolutist stance in terms of the Constitution.
So it
right?
just
Do you take an
means
absolutist
whatever you
stance
want
on the
it to say.
Constitution? Well, obviously, I'm going to
I am a
interpret the law in a manner in
textualist,
which,
yes.
yeah, I'm going to interpret the law in a particular way that's going to be more accordance with my desires. It's not going to just be predicated off of what currently exists in terms of the Constitution, because I wouldn't think that what
Or what
exists
it
under
says.
law is always justified.
I think if it's not justified, you have to amend it. You have to change it. I don't think you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
reimagine what it says, because if it doesn't mean what it says, then it can mean anything at all. To you, it might mean one thing. To a Republican-appointed judge, it might mean something totally different, right? The First Amendment has to mean what it says. The Second
Hold on,
Amendment has to mean what it says.
I'm not disputing. So you're saying legally how it should be applied right now. I'm talking about how it should be applied from my perspective. So if I have the ability to amend the Constitution in this type of way, I would do that. Like if that makes sense. But you understand like the political realities of influencing that type of amendment to exist would be pretty hard to do, right?
Yeah, practically. But so just philosophically, though, you're comfortable taking someone's rights away, like freedom of speech, freedom of press, Second Amendment rights, even if there's a 49% chance they're innocent of the thing that you think they did. That's like almost a coin flip.
So we're talking about 51% plus in terms of preponderance of evidence. If someone is held civilly liable of these sorts of things, it's not typically just 51%, right? Although the minimum is 50%, it's not always 51%. So the likelihood of these types of things is actually typically higher than that for it to actually be accurate. Especially when we talk about jury decisions that tend to be unanimous, right? When we're talking about like, say, a split decision, if we had like a 5-4 proceeding, right, that would be a significantly like a lower likelihood of probability than you would expect if you had a 9-person jury unanimously determine that. So you could also make a distinction predicated on that.
Preponderance of evidence can be as low as 51% certainty.
Yeah. But
so
like
there
again,
would be cases in which people would lose their rights over essentially a coin flip burden of proof. Because when it's money changing hands, I mean, that's much less significant than taking people's rights away.
Again, what rights are you referencing? Right?
You said very clear, because like you said Second Amendment rights.
We're talking about like, say, if we're talking someone who's been held civilly liable unanimously by a jury of 9 people for forcibly penetrating a woman's vagina against her will, I think they shouldn't be able to get access to like a newspaper. I'm totally fine with saying that, right? Like that's not an issue with me. Is that an issue to you?
Yeah, if there's a 49% chance they might not have done that thing.
Well,
you're
again,
gonna
why are you
deprive
assuming
them?
the lowest possible? When I said 9 people, unanimously of 9 people, why are you
Right.
assuming the lowest possible
Because
probability?
that is the only burden they have to clear. I agree with you that in some cases they might actually be 99% certain, but that's the actual minimum standard. So
Yeah, because of the limitations that exist. Like, for example, with Donald Trump, there's a limitation in terms of statute of limitations with criminal courts. So we wouldn't be able to test whether or not it meet the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt because of the statute of limitations that exist.
yeah, I
So like
acknowledge that.
obviously like under the current law, like I would say that there are going to be plenty of civil liability cases that are not able to be tried in criminal courts, where I think they should have restricted access to it. Now you could say maybe there are certain civil cases where the probability is just so low, right? Maybe it's close to that 51% where you're like, okay, maybe I'm not okay with giving it up in that particular circumstance, right? But then you could make a distinction between other types of civil cases, right? Even if you take that perspective where you're like, okay, I don't want them because they had such a high probability of this happening to them and it couldn't be tried in criminal courts. I don't want them to have access to these certain things. So I have a question. If it was 99% likelihood, right, based on a civil liability case that they forcefully penetrated a child against their will, right, and they were not able to be tried in a criminal court because of statute of limitations law, would you restrict their rights to get access to a gun?
So I've always said criminal convictions, I'm comfortable with those kinds of restrictions. The counter argument you'll hear from some absolutist libertarians is if they're still so dangerous, they shouldn't be out of jail in the first place. And I think I can see why they would say that. But I've always been comfortable with criminal convictions coming along of serious crimes and assaults, coming with a determination that you can't purchase a firearm. Will it really stop a determined criminal? Not necessarily. Now, if you're saying, could you give civil juries the option to say, in this case, we actually are certain beyond a reasonable doubt as well, and we would like to also enact a deprivation of Second Amendment rights, I could potentially get on board with that. Yeah. I mean, I just want, when we're talking about taking people's fundamental rights away, and I believe freedom of speech and the right to self-defense are fundamental human rights, I don't support a low standard of evidence or doing that willy-nilly. And it sounds like you're much more comfortable with that, which is maybe just a fundamental disagreement.
So you did say that like someone who is 99% likelihood and they were held civilly liable, but they weren't able to be tried in a criminal court, you would say in that circumstance they should have restricted access to a gun.
I think there could be a way you could do that would be just and fair. Yeah, if juries could certify had the option to do that, maybe that would make sense. If they were still being clear that in this case, we're more than 51% sure. We are 99% sure. I don't want the low burden of proof used to deny people their fundamental rights. So
sure. So then when I would ask you, like, what probability would then justify restricting people's rights? Like, would you have any type of like sort of, I'm not asking for like a specific number, like maybe like a range, like does it have to be 99%?
I think it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. Yeah. I mean, these are core human rights we're talking about. This isn't, your ability to go on vacation. Like, this is your fundamental human right to express yourself, your fundamental right to defend your life and your property and your family from other people. I think that has to be really fundamental. I do want to...
So 85%?
I say 99%. I say beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay, so at 85%, you would be okay with them getting access to a gun legally?
I wouldn't want to deprive someone of their human rights based off a 15% chance they're innocent. No.
Of sexual abuse?
Yeah.
Okay, but so are you in support of the death penalty?
No.
Okay.
My belief on the death penalty has always been, I don't think the government is good at doing things. I don't think it's efficient or effective. So I would rather have 20 people spend life in prison than execute one innocent person. Mm-hmm. So I do want to move along. We can talk about this stuff more long form, maybe if we go live on TikTok together. Yeah, I want to play you a clip of E. Jean Carroll from CNN. Take a listen.
You don't feel like a victim.
I was not thrown on the ground and ravished, which the word rape carries so many sexual connotations. This was not sexual. It hurt.
Well, I think most people think of rape as it is a violent assault. It is not.
I think most people think of rape as being sexy.
Let's take a short break.
Think of the fantasies.
We're just going to take a quick break. If you can stick around, we'll talk more on the other side.
You're fascinating to talk to.
Yeah.
So
Can I address these two? Because like there's two things here, right? One, when we're talking about grape, right, the heavy influence behind grape,
you can
right,
say
is
rape.
not.
It's not TikTok.
Sorry. No, I was in the. That's just not like intentional for me. I'm just so used to doing that, especially because I'm on the iPad. So in terms of rape, right, the many influences that exist behind rape, right, aren't just necessarily like what people would say in terms of sexual attraction. It's in terms of power.
Yeah,
Right.
I
So
agree. I
like there's a
acknowledge
heavy
that. Yeah.
influence. And I think that's what she's trying to allude to in that particular context is that it wasn't necessarily like the circumstance that it was predicated off of like whether or not there was an attraction. It was predicated off of the fact that there was an exert of influence or power over another individual. Right. And then when she's referencing other people who think that like it's quote unquote sexy, she's referencing like the fact that there's like grape culture prevalent within our society, that people might view this in even like a positive connotation in sort of a sexual manner, which is disgusting, despicable, and it shouldn't be viewed that way. And I think that's alluded to like later in the conversation.
Do you think she comes off as credible and stable in that clip?
If you just take that soundbite, like of course I don't think that like disputes her credibility.
You don't think her saying and leaving Anderson Cooper stunned, saying rape is, most people think of rape as sexy. You don't think that's a strange thing to say, at least?
No, because I just explained it, right? People think of it that way because it perpetuates grape culture. She's acknowledging that there's a problem with grape culture.
Sexy?
I can dispute that, right? But that doesn't mean that she's not credible or reliable, right? She's just perpetuating an idea that there's this idea in culture and society, right? That this type of thing, right, isn't like this violent and terrible act. It's specifically like this quote unquote sexy thing, right? And it's portrayed in a positive connotation, which perpetuates worse conditions for this to continue to occur, right? So she's arguing that this is bad in a certain context. So if you just clip it, have you watched the whole Anderson Cooper interview?
Yes, I have.
Okay,
yeah.
so you then watched her talk about the fact that she thinks that this isn't the way that they should view it, right?
Right. I just think she comes off across the whole thing as, I mean, it doesn't mean she wasn't victimized, to be clear. I mean, victims don't have to be perfect, but she does not come off as super reliable or credible. She comes off as a little bit confused.
Okay, so then like here would be my question. Let's say you don't think that she's credible, right? Do you think that Donald Trump is more credible given that he said that he wouldn't have sexually abused her because she's quote unquote not his type, but then in a deposition mistook her with his ex-wife, indicating they're either both his type or both not his type?
No,
given
I don't
that he
think
would have
Trump is
sexually abused her
credible
either
at
way.
all. I think he lies all the time.
Okay, wait, so who is more credible?
Does one of them have to be more? Can't they both lack credibility?
They could both lack credibility, but that doesn't mean they have the same level of credibility.
I guess I don't know nearly as much about her. I don't trust anything Trump says. I would verify anything he says because I've seen him lie so many times.
Well, I agree. So, like, we know that he was lying about these circumstances. So, obviously, if we can identify that he was lying about these set of circumstances and she hasn't lied about these circumstances, whether or not you think that she's less credible because of the way that she frames these particular positions, or whether or not you disagree with her on the prevalence of grape culture within our society, that doesn't take away the fact that she's more reliable about the set of occurrences that happen than Donald Trump is.
I guess my only point in bringing this clip up to you is not that, like I told you, I'm bothered by this about Trump. I'm bothered by the other allegations by women against him. Mm-hmm. But I know so many people who I know to be good people who voted for Trump, and they don't believe E. Jean Carroll. It's not that they're voting for someone who they think is a rapist. It's that they don't think he's guilty and they don't find her credible. And you might disagree with that. I don't think they're crazy for thinking that. I don't think they're terrible people for thinking that, because she comes off as not very credible. I wanted to be a lawyer before I went into journalism.
But you don't think they're crazy for thinking that Trump is credible?
Well, I think politics makes a lot of people crazy.
Okay, so they are crazy.
Well, they're not like literally crazy. No, I think if they think Trump is a totally truthful person, I think that would be a kind of delusional belief. Yeah.
That's kind of what they're relying on here. They're relying on just that Trump said, oh, it didn't happen. She's not the chosen one. And that's like a good enough position for them. And then they're not going to accept any civil liability. They don't accept his criminal cases, right? A lot of these people, they don't accept the results of the last election. And we both agree those things are like insane for them to believe. Right. So a lot of these people, you could say that they're good people. They're heavily misinformed. Right. I'm not saying that they're bad people necessarily. I'm saying they're heavily misinformed. Right. And they because of all the confusing nonsense of people lying in the media
doesn't require you to be heavily misinformed. It's not. I mean, she's not super credible. There's not much actual evidence.
Wait, what do you mean? Wait, can you name two pieces of evidence in the case that were submitted?
Her testimony. I don't know. wasn't their address. This was a couple of years ago now.
It wasn't necessarily submitted because Trump didn't give up his DNA within the 2 to 3 years allotted for him to give it up. So like the point I'm saying is that a lot of people don't know about the case and they assume that it has less credibility because literally tens of millions of people don't believe it because they believe whatever Trump says. And I get that there's a lot of people out there that you think are genuine people. Again, she said a lot of people think of it that way, which is a bad thing. She then elucidated on the fact that that's bad.
It's a very strange clip and a very strange thing to say.
You could
say
it
comes off very strange. She comes off.
You could say it's strange. That doesn't reduce her credibility.
It kind of does.
How?
Because if she holds strange views, she says she didn't feel victimized, but it was also violent, and it wasn't about sex, which I agree. It's not always about sex.
Wait, can I clarify that? When she says that, like, okay, so there are plenty of circumstances where people are victimized, and because of how society portrays them as a victim, they don't know how to understand that they are a victim in plenty of circumstances. So whether or not someone doesn't feel like a victim, right, particularly, that doesn't change the idea that they aren't a victim. That just perpetuates the idea that because people in society don't view them as a victim or don't believe them, right, that they might try to dispute in their own head that was the case that it happened, right? You understand that happens with plenty of victims. I know people in my own life, right, who have experienced circumstances like this where it was hard for them to portray themselves as a victim, to see themselves as a victim, right, because of how people like view this in society. So I don't think that any of these things are reducing her credibility.
Yeah, I guess I do disagree with you. I don't think they mean she's a liar, but I do think a person who has very clear recollection of the facts, has an extremely clear accounting of what happened, doesn't have ambiguity, doesn't come across as confused, is more credible than someone who does. It doesn't mean she's necessarily lying.
Actually, is that true? Like, actually, in criminal cases, like, for example, if you have, like, a set story and everything is consistent about it, don't they see that as, like, evidence against it? That it was, like, something that was, like, brought up before that, like, oh, you're just trying to portray a particular story? They actually use this in cases against people.
That they have a consistent story? No, consistency in your story is something you look for to establish a witness as credible.
Wait, actually, if you look at consistency, you understand that if we have total 100% consistency and that there's no discrepancies in perspective, that's going to indicate that they had some type of conversation or a meeting or sort of they might have portrayed views together to be able to get a story together before they came to like the court case or the setting.
I think you're talking about across multiple witnesses. I'm talking about one witness. If their story isn't consistent over time, that's a sign that they're either maybe misremembering or their memory is not 100% sharp or that they're lying. I mean, if you watch
So let's make a distinction. When we say logically consistent versus just misremembering, I think we can make a distinction between those. If someone misremembers a date, I don't think that makes their story inconsistent, right? So we're talking from a single perspective.
Christine Blasey Ford, who accused Brett Kavanaugh, couldn't remember what year the alleged assault happened. That does reduce the credibility of her accusation.
Really? So I have a friend who was assaulted as a child. He doesn't remember the specific year. You're saying it reduces the credibility of his position because he doesn't remember the year?
Well, I think it's different with a child than with somebody who I think that was when they were in high school.
Okay. If they're in high school, if they were assaulted in high school and they don't remember the specific year, right? I don't think that reduces their credibility.
It doesn't mean they're a liar, but yes, it does make the accusation, because also it's harder to defend yourself against an accusation that you don't even know when it allegedly happened. How can you provide yourself an alibi or explain that you weren't there or whatever when they're not even naming a year in which this occurred? I understand trauma affects the brain in different ways, and some people forget things. And so I'm not saying it means they're, a liar making things up to take someone down, but it does reduce the certainty with which we're able to evaluate their accusation. That's my point. When there's a lack of clarity or consistency or specificity to their accusations or their memories. And when we're talking about
consistency, that's just misremembering, right? And humans typically misremember. And like you said, it's expected, actually, if someone is through a traumatic event, that they might misremember it. Right, that's expected. So if we have that expectation, I don't know how that's going to reduce the credibility or the probability of it being true, given the fact that, again, we expect this to be the case. It's probable to be the case, right, if someone is traumatized in that type of way.
Well, I don't know if I don't know if it happens in the majority of cases or not, but I guess I start from the premise that we have to prove that this thing is true before we can punish someone for it. And so the question is not, is this way that they're responding to it bad or good, normal or abnormal? It's just, are we able to prove this thing or not? And the less detail, the less specificity to their memory, the less concrete the accusation, the more inconsistent the accusation is over time. There were some serious inconsistencies to Christine Blasey Ford's story. I know more about that one than I do about E. Jean Carroll, because I covered.
Wait, so can we use that same? Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I really apologize. I have a point that I think that we could elucidate on. Right. So then, couldn't we use the same type of idea to reduce the credibility of Donald Trump?
I mean, yeah,
right. Like the fact that he lied, the fact that
to me.
Okay, wait. So again, when we're evaluating who's right in a particular circumstance, either E. Jean Carroll or Donald Trump. Right. If we're judging that on the probability of it being accurate, wouldn't we take the one that is more probable in making like an accurate claim?
Well, I start from the presumption of innocent until proven guilty. So I start
you could say that,
assuming that people are innocent until I feel we've proved that they are guilty. And if they're both not credible, and we started at the point that they're innocent, that doesn't take us to the point that they're guilty. You see what I'm saying?
Wait, so what establishes E. Jean Carroll is not credible? Because you would just say that you wouldn't believe anything in that circumstance, I'm guessing?
It's not that you don't believe anything she says. It's that I find her to be not credible when she goes on television and speaks in such a bizarre manner about rape and about sex and about her own experience as a victim. I find it reduces her credibility.
Wait, so you from your position can't say it didn't happen either?
No.
So you can't say it did or didn't happen?
No, I can't say
it just sounds like you're saying like you want to be agnostic on it?
Well, because it's not proven to be true by a high standard of proof. So
okay, but you didn't even know most of the evidence in the case.
Sorry, I just lost you for a second there.
You didn't know most of the evidence in the case, so how are you evaluating that?
Well, partly because I guess you're right. It hasn't been tried criminally, so I can't know that. But again, I start at the presumption of innocence. Do you believe in innocence?
Did you look at the evidence though?
I did at the time. That case was a couple of years ago now.
Sure. Yeah. So if we're, I mean, well, the proceeding, the liability was like last year or 2 years, like 2 years, less than 2 years ago. But like the point I'm making from this is that if we don't know the evidence, then we can't specifically evaluate that one particular party would be innocent or guilty from that particular respect, right? From your perspective, you would just be assuming that they're innocent, correct?
Right. I do assume that people are innocent until they're proven guilty.
Okay, so, but you, in order to evaluate whether or not they're proven guilty, you have to look at the evidence of the case, correct?
Right. Which we did do. We all did at the time, and we poured through it.
I don't think we all did, and that's the issue.
Well, people covering journalism did. People working in media and journalism did. I remember I covered the case on television on Fox at the time, and I said it was disturbing for that he was found civilly liable for it. So I remember we digged it. The problem is when you're covering politics, and I'm sure you'll come to see.
Why is it disturbing?
Why is it disturbing?
Yeah, under your view, why is it disturbing? Because
there's a good chance he did it. There's a good chance he did it, and it's consistent with some of his other comments. And I have always thought Donald Trump was a pig towards women, and it was very clear. I mean, he's said it on camera. It's one of many reasons I've never supported him.
So you would say it's likely true.
It's more likely than not. It's at least 51% because we know that from what the jury found.
Sure. But like if you had to establish some type of probability, would you say it's more right than 51% probable?
I guess I would say I don't know. I'd have to review the case in full before I could assess that.
Mm-hmm. If you like knew one of your, so I don't want to go. We can go into this further questioning about like the case if you don't think you have time here. But like I can run this down so many different ways. Like, would you be accepting of this standard of evidence as like a friend?
Well, it's
right?
a little,
would you
it's a
be
little
friends
different
with them still?
In a political context because false accusations are incredibly rare in normal life where people don't have an incentive to lie about someone. False accusations are decidedly less rare in celebrity or political instances where, I mean, look at Brett Kavanaugh. A couple of the accusations that came out against him totally fell apart and were revealed to be complete bunk, actually made up. Now, not Christine Blasey Ford, which just remained unproven, but when there's a political person that people despise, there is a much higher probability that somebody might make a false claim on them. False claims don't happen frequently in day-to-day life of sexual assault or of rape. So a woman doesn't wake up and decide to, with rare exceptions, it actually has happened in a couple cases, of course, to just accuse someone of horrifically assaulting them. It is different in celebrity and political cases where there's potential huge payoffs to be had. There's political motivations to be had. So I do think you have to be significantly more skeptical of claims in the political arena than you would ever be in just in your day-to-day life.
Okay, so you would say that with like rich people as well, like because there could be like a rich person who has money where someone wants to falsify a claim against them, right?
I mean,
so you'd say it's more likely in that circumstance.
This happens to like celebrity athletes and that kind of thing. Yeah, you also have to be more skeptical. It doesn't mean they didn't do it. Of course, lots of them are sick perverts and assaulters, as we've seen. But you do have to be more skeptical because some people do accuse very wealthy people or very famous people of things looking for a payoff.
Okay, well then I could ask you this question. Let's say you knew someone that was like a celebrity, right? Yeah. And they had the same sort of case against them. They were held actually, let's just say you were friends with Trump, right? And you found out about this.
I don't think I would be friends with Trump.
There we go. That's my point. Like, would you still continue to be friends with someone like Trump? And it sounds like no, you wouldn't, right? Because you think it's good enough of a chance that he did it that like, okay, I think this person's morally detestable. I don't want to engage with them. Now, you might not think it should restrict someone's rights. You might not think it should do all those other things, right? But it's enough of a probabilistic chance that you're going to like believe it insofar as that you do not want to be friends with that person.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, if I had a friend who was found civilly liable for sexually abusing a woman, I would, unless I knew from somehow personal experience they didn't do it, right? Say that I knew this was a wrong outcome. I think I'd have to reevaluate being friends with them. And I guess it would come down to whether I really believe they did it or not. But I would certainly be very disturbed by it. But I think the problem, Parker, is that people, and I disagree with this because I'm old fashioned. I think character matters in politics. People decided a long time ago they don't give a shit. The people who support Trump, most of them, if they're really being honest, will admit he's a bad person. They don't think he's a good person. They think he will do better for the country. And you might strongly disagree with that. I know you do, but so they might too credulously discount accusations against Trump, all this, but they have essentially decided that things that affect millions of people. Put yourself in the minds, for example, of somebody who's deeply pro-life. I have a more moderate view on it, but who believes hundreds of thousands of babies are being killed every year. And they want a president who they believe is going to put a stop to that. And that president may have sexually assaulted a woman decades ago. Do you see how they could find that calculus worth it if you accept their premise and their framing that they believe, and well, this is true, millions of people are streaming into our country illegally, right? And some of them are committing horrible crimes. That these things that affect so many millions of people, obviously it's complicated. They blame the Biden administration for inflation that bankrupted so many families. If they might just not care about, or they might decide it vastly, vastly outweighs the shortcomings of an individual person. I don't really go there myself, but I don't think that's insane calculus to make.
I do think it's insane calculus because we can go through it. Like, again, we're talking about like, say, abortion, right? What is the difference in the amount of abortions that happen after Roe versus Wade was overturned versus Roe versus Wade being in place, right? That would be the distinction in the amount of lives that you're specifically referencing. It's not like going to be the millions. And then in terms of immigration, we just referenced that Trump literally kept this issue going on by undermining the bipartisan border bill. So that would have specifically helped with the scenario. We can talk about all of these different scenarios. None of the calculus makes sense. Now, if they want to portray it in a way that like, millions of people are dead because of Biden, inflation happened because of Biden, and they want to say all of those things were true, right? Their calculus, that still wouldn't make sense to me because I think that character ultimately matters. But from their perspective, they see it to make sense. And I think that is harmful. I think that is bad. And I don't think that we should look at that as like, oh, this is just like some normal, typical view people have in society. We're talking about fucking terrible things here. We're not talking about like just like some run of the mill normal thing, right? Along with the whole 2020 debacle. Like, we can turn the country, like attempt to turn
this back on you because my views lean right on the actual issues, but I'm an independent, so I'm not a loyalist to either party. I didn't support any candidate in 2020 or 2024, and I comment on things and I do my best to call balls and strikes. Say, I think so-and-so is right about this. I think so-and-so is wrong about this. I just disagreed with Republicans on the bathroom bills. I'll probably agree with them on something next week because I do lean more right. To me, though, doesn't it tell you in another sense how massively Democrats have failed, that they are still losing to somebody who is so deeply flawed, who has so much insane baggage. Like, they couldn't even beat. Another way to put it is like, oh my God, people actually voted for Donald Trump. Another way to look at it is, oh my God, you guys couldn't beat Donald Trump with all his baggage, all the material to work with. Doesn't that also tell you you're doing something terribly wrong?
So yeah, there's a few things here. Yeah, I do think that the messaging of the Democratic Party is flawed. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, the messaging of the Democratic Party, it's incredible. I've never seen something like it before. I definitely think there are flaws with the messaging of the Democratic Party. But I think the main reason that Kamala lost is because of the inflation, right? People attributing inflation to the president. I think it's wrong. I don't think it makes sense. But the point I'm saying is they think gas prices up, inflation up, president fault, right? And that happened around the entire world. We saw incumbencies around the entire world where the presidencies, right, specifically the prime ministers, they were all taken out of office, right? Almost all of them, right? Because of people attributing inflation to the incumbent president.
Biden
so I think
did
that is
make
the biggest explanation.
Biden did make inflation worse with the American Rescue Plan. I agree it would have happened anyway. He added several.
Well, then Trump made it even worse.
I actually agree that Trump printed trillions of dollars out of thin air and signed massive wasteful stimulus spending, and that contributed to inflation. I also agree that
actually, he signed off on more spending, actually, like the 8.4 trillion overall debt related spending.
But that was also, to be clear, though, that was peak pandemic. Biden came in.
Oh, wait, that's why I referenced non-COVID related spending. If you look at the non-COVID related debt spending from Trump's administration, it's more than the COVID and non-COVID related spending that Biden signed into law. 4.3 trillion overall for Biden. So wow, yeah, really? I understand your perspective. Actually, the most fiscally responsible position would be to have voted for Democrats. If you're talking about whether or not it's Democrats or Republicans winning, I understand your perspective of obviously libertarians would be more fiscally
the best balanced, but the most closest to a balanced budget we get is when you have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. And there's gridlock.
Which would have happened if Kamala won, by the way.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, part of the problem is she has such a broad view of executive action, and the Biden administration does as well. They tried to do they weren't really content with the restraints on their power. They tried to do many things via executive action that they don't have a constitutional right to do because they couldn't get legislation passed through Congress, like student debt relief, for example. They tried to pass it through Congress, as the Constitution says you have to spend taxpayer money. Congress said no, and they're like, we're going to try to do it anyway via executive authority. They then went all the way to the Supreme Court and lost because you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. Yep. So it would make Democrats would have a better argument about Trump and norms and him being such a unique aberration if they were more committed to norms and systems themselves. I mean, major leaders in the Democratic Party want to pack the Supreme Court, a move dictators do, add more justices because they don't like its rulings. I mean, you have most of the biggest people in the Senate on the Democratic side support that. Biden and Harris.
I actually have a response to that. I have a response to that. So in terms of this, the Republicans at the end of Obama's administration said that he was a lame duck president, that he shouldn't be able to appoint new and nominate new judges. Right, that goes against
Trump did that
and then Trump did that, right? So they went against the precedents.
Yes.
So the only thing that specifically, right, they'd be going against if they added more judges is precedents that exists, right? So if we're saying it's okay for Republicans to do it, then you'd have to say it's okay for Democrats to do it. But since you're arguing both of them, it's wrong for them to do it. That's a completely consistent view from your point.
Yeah, I mean, I said at the time that one, I thought Merrick Garland should have got a vote. They screwed Obama unfairly, and two. Though I was like, I think freshman in college when that happened, so I wasn't really doing commentary yet. And two, they're total hypocrites for pushing through it. Amy Coney Barrett in the final year of Trump's presidency. But I mean, they're all politicians. None of them give a shit about precedents. Democrats got rid of the judicial filibuster, which for federal appointees, for federal judges, and then that paved the way for Republicans to get rid of it for Supreme Court nominees. And that's how they got Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and ACB on. When if they'd still had the judicial filibuster, they would have had to put more moderate nominees. It's like, I don't really buy that any of these people in DC on either side give a shit about norms or precedent. I do. The reason I think court packing is uniquely pernicious is not because it just defies precedent, but it's because it would end the Supreme. I think, first of all, our Supreme Court, by and large, has done a very good job. This current court. I'm sure you disagree with many of its decisions. I agree with more than I disagree. I disagree with a few. But I think it's a legitimate institution that is not ultimately political. They've ruled against Trump and Republicans many times, including on 2020 election. And what would happen is if Democrats did do court packing and they added 3 liberal justices to skew it in their favor, when Republicans came back in power, they would add 3 more. And it would start the destructive effect. And before you know it, we wouldn't have a Supreme Court with any legitimacy at all. We'd lose one of the branches of our government. So I just have a much harder time accepting Democrats as the party that's going to put the sane people in charge or go back to respecting norms when half the Democratic Party wants to blow the system up in ways that are similar to, if not as bad as, the way that Trump wants to blow the system up.
So I don't think that's like the similar or as bad as how Trump wants to blow up the system, because we talk about like 2020, him literally like denying the results of the election, getting tens of millions of people to believe that, and then sending false slates of electors to the Electoral College to cast Trump votes when he didn't win. Like all of those things are like way well beyond us just talking
the
about
Supreme
like
Court as we know it.
I don't think that necessarily. Okay, so I wanted to give you pushback on that. I don't think it destroys the Supreme Court. Now, I do agree with you. It's going to lead to sort of a political aspect of the Supreme Court where it's more politicized than it currently is right now. But that doesn't necessarily destroy the Supreme Court.
I think,
and again, I don't see the
events that would.
Well, again, you could say the same thing with the lame duck presidency of them saying the lame duck on the other side. That's destroying precedent. So I don't see how it's uniquely destroying precedents in such a way in which it would allow for that. The only distinction I can see that you could try to make is that there's a difference in how often they could do it. Right, with a lame duck specifically, right? It's only in the circumstances where you have an open seat.
That's just about putting a judge on the Supreme Court when there's a vacancy, expanding the court
that's exactly what I was saying.
With the explicit aim of hijacking its ideological majority is a different can of worms. It's something fundamentally
Both of them are for ideological majority, right? The lame duck presidency, they're getting 3 of them. That was for ideological superiority within the context of the Supreme Court. That's explicitly what it was. Getting rid of the, like what you said, the judicial filibuster was also that.
It's within somewhat normal rules of the game. It's flip-flopping on precedent, I agree with you, to try to get your guy on the Supreme Court. To actually fundamentally change the institution to serve you and skew it and rewrite the whole rules of it. It's been 9 for hundreds of years. The Constitution doesn't force it to be 9, although it should. I would support an amendment for that. Is fundamentally different than just doing political shenanigans and being a hypocrite to get your choice on the court.
Yeah, but you could say the changing of the filibuster within the context of the judicial branch. Do you think that specifically led to more conservative judges, right? That could be also viewed as, right, a specific like hurt to the court that changed the ideological makeup where otherwise it would have been more moderate.
That's why it was wrong to get rid of the judicial filibuster.
And that's where I'm agreeing with you, but like I don't see specifically. Well, I disagree with that. Actually, I disagree with the getting rid of the judicial filibuster. But like
Democrats,
in terms of this,
Harry Reid did that in I think 2014.
Yeah, so but like my point with that is that again, in terms of this, if we're going to argue that it's really, really bad in terms of like the adding to the judges uniquely worse than all of these other circumstances, well then we also have to I think argue that it's just as bad on the other side in terms of like the lame duck presidents and other stuff like that. And you can argue there's a distinction, but it creates a culture where again the Democrats wanted to create more judges. The whole makeup of the lame duck presidency, I mean not lame duck presidency, lame duck judicial branch, like getting the lame duck nominations, right? That specifically added to the cultural push for Democrats to want to add more judges. If that didn't happen, right, then they wouldn't be pushing for this.
Well, so like, they might. So when you say that, I agree with you that it contributed to the reason. So. The reason Democrats are so hostile to the Supreme Court is in part because they feel Republicans achieve the majority through unfair or illegitimate means, which has some truth to it. I agree. I do acknowledge that. Now, Parker, we are already way over the time I budgeted for this. You and I think we could talk for a lot longer. We're going to go live on TikTok together soon. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate the conversation and the dialogue, and we'll talk more later. All right, everybody, I'm going to have to skip the TikTok reactions and the comments for today because we ran way over time. Please do let me know what you think of my conversation with Parker. Do hit the like button before you go, and we'll talk again on Monday.